and welcome back to yet another video. This week I'm going to be showing you how I made all the props for my Cardcaptor Sakura costume. Now this is the final part in the series of making my Cardcaptor Sakura costume, so if you want to see how I made everything else, I will link it all down below and I'll link to the playlist up top here somewhere. But in this video I will be showing you how to make the book, Kero, and the Clow staff. So without any further ado, let's dive on into it. To make my own Clow book, I first needed a base book, so I found this one at the second-hand shop. It's a Stephen King Dreamcatcher book, which I thought was quite fitting because, you know, card captors, dream catching, whatever. And then I have this red linen, which I plan to cover the book in. So the first thing I had to do was free the pages from the original book cover, so I just used an X-Acto knife and cut them straight out. Next I had to figure out how big of a hole I needed to cut into the book for the cards to fit in there, so I traced a card, making sure it was centre, and then straightened up the lines using a ruler. Once I was happy with the size and shape of the hole, I then used the same X-Acto knife and began cutting through the layers of the book. This was actually quite a difficult part of the process because you could only cut through so many layers of the pages at a time, and I had to try my best to make sure that the rectangle hole for the cards stayed straight, and yeah, very time consuming. After cutting through as many layers as I thought the cards needed, I tested them to fit, and then I brought out my Dremel to sand down the edges of the pages just to make sure that they were all nice and uniform on the inside. Then it was time to fix the pages in place by using a concoction of PVA glue and water. So as you can see here, I just sponged it all in place. And I used a clamp to hold the pages in place so they wouldn't shift around as the glue was drying. After it was sufficiently coated in glue, I then wrapped it in parchment paper so that the glue didn't seep through to the places where I didn't want it, and then I put some heavy books and weights on it and left it to dry overnight. Now onto the covers. So as you can see here, I have my red linen and I'm putting some interfacing on the back of it so that when I eventually glue it to the covers, the PVA glue doesn't seep through to the linen. Using the original book cover as a guide, I trace around it and then square up the edges so that they're nice and square. I then add a seam allowance to it and then cut out the shape that I've drawn. I then cut the corners at a diagonal so that when I eventually fold over these edges onto the cover, they don't overlap on themselves. Then I add a thin layer of PVA glue to the original cover, making sure to coat the entire thing. The old cover then gets glued into the new cover. And just like the pages before it, I wrap it in some parchment paper and then put some heavy weights on top of it and leave it to dry overnight. While all the glue was drying, I then moved on to digitizing the Clow book design itself. So I did this using Photoshop and created a series of vectors which I could then put through my Cricut machine and cut onto vinyl. And here is the vinyl. So for the gold parts I used this metallic gold iron-on vinyl, and for the white parts I just used a matte white vinyl. I absolutely love weeding. It is so satisfying just peeling out the little pieces, so let's get into it. So a fun fact, I actually end up doing two covers, this one being the first. And the reason I ended up doing two is because I don't think I did enough detail in the first run of the cover. So you'll notice that the cover will change eventually, and that is the reasoning. After the vinyls have been weeded, it is time to apply them to the cover, so I do my best to line them up as square as possible on the cover and then just iron them in place. It's that easy. And ta-da! That is the first version of this cover done. Now it's time to glue those edges down. Once again, I'm just using a PVA glue and water concoction and brushing that in place and then folding the edges over. To keep the edges in place while the glue is drying, I used some hair clips I had lying around and just clipped everywhere. This is another part of the process that also gets left to dry overnight. So once again, while the glue was drying, I moved on to another part, this being the inside cover inserts. I cut out 2 pages matching the original page size that came from the original book, first from a cream piece of paper and second from a red. I then got this design that I had previously cut out of the Cricut and ironed it over the top of the 2 pieces, thus creating the inside cover page. And here you can see me detailing the little phases of the moon, and I'm just doing that using a gold and black nail polish for some reason. Not paint, nail polish. And while that was drying, I decided to make the strap that actually closes the book. So I have that cotton webbing there, and what I'm doing on the back part of the book halfway down is just gluing a length of it right across the whole thing. Happy with the placement of the webbing, I then apply a lot of PVA glue to the back cover only, and that is so that I can finally glue back in the page block because it is dried. And of course, I must now apply weights and heavy books so that that part of the book can dry. Once it has, it's time to apply some fake pages to the front of the book. So as you can see here, I've taped off a little margin and applied some PVA glue, and then I'm applying PVA glue to the front cover of the book as well. I then peel away the glue, and then using a folded piece of page that I cut from the card earlier, I apply that to the front of the pages and then very carefully close the cover. And don't forget to put some heavy books and weights on it and leave it to dry overnight. With some super glue, it is now time to bedazzle the cover, and have you noticed it's actually the new, more detailed cover? Basically, all I'm doing here is applying a series of rhinestones and things to the front cover, just matching the reference as I go along. With the cover bedazzled, it is now time to move on to actually finishing the closure strap. So using some scrap warbler pieces I had lying around, I first drew out this template on paper. I then cut it out and then transferred it to a piece of warbler. Then I cut out the shape and covered it in the same gold vinyl that I had used on the rest of the book. After the front and back pieces were covered, I then used the same super glue to glue them onto the book. To make the closures functional, I glued on some tiny little snaps to this part here, and you can't see it, but just underneath my hand there is the closing strap, and that has the other piece. So the book corners finally arrived. Here is one just put on the corner. Here is one put on the corner with the gems. And here is what one looks like completely raw. Anyway, all you do is just grab the corner of the book, slide it on like that, and then using some pliers just crimp it down. And it's really that easy. And then to apply the gems, I just use the super glue that I've been using for everything and glue them in place. Voila, the book is almost done. Next up, Kero. He is made entirely of this white minky fabric, but as you can see, it is white, so we need to dye it. But first, let me introduce you to the pattern I'm using. So this is a free pattern I found online, and it is by So Desune, and it is perfect. The first thing I did after discovering that pattern was create some embroidery files for Kero's mouth, Karupi's eyes, which I don't end up making, and the little swirls that go on Kero's wings. Speaking of, let's embroider those wings. So I cut out a rough bit of white fabric, big enough so that the wings could be cut out of it later, and began hooping it up. In the hoop we have a layer of tearaway interfacing followed by the minky fabric, then it gets hooped up, and then it's over to the machine. After the embroidery is finished, it's time to actually cut out the wings. So I lined up the embroidery with the little swirl that you can see on the bottom edge there, and then cut out all of the pieces necessary for the wings. Alright, now that the wing bits are both done, it is time to dye the rest of the fabric yellow. Because I'm dyeing a synthetic fabric, I first need to prepare the dye bath. So I did this by adding dishwashing liquid. That helps the dye itself actually move around and adhere to the fabrics a lot easier. And then I added some yellows, and I just sort of eyeballed it until I got a colour I was happy with. Then I added in the white mink fabric, stirred it around a bit, and voila, we have dyed fabric. And before I cut out any of the pattern pieces, just like with the wings, I embroidered the mouthpiece first. So I got a section that was big enough and then went to town on the embroidery machine. Once it was done, I then cut out the pattern pieces and then I moved on to the head. So the first thing I wanted to do was add the eyes to it. So I marked out where they needed to be, and then using the teddy bear safety eyes that you just saw earlier, I made holes for them using an awl and just poked them through. And here he is with two eyes. On to the ears. The inner ears were cut from the lighter yellow fabric, and then the rest of Kero was cut out of the darker yellow fabric. The first part of him we make are the ears. So this is the front part of the ear, and we sew the inner circle into that other one and create the semicircle, and that creates the front part of the ears. And then we add the back on and then sew that in place as well. Then the ears get sewn to the front part of the head. Once the ears are attached, it's time to sew on the back of the head. Next up, the arms. Once both the arms are done, they get lightly stuffed and then attached to the body. Next it's time to make and attach the wings. So here is one pair and I sew around that edge there. And then I sew a tiny little tube to make his tail. And all these pieces get attached to the back part of Kero. First I sew up his centre back seam, which is quite difficult because you've got such a tiny seam allowance and the wings and the tail bits are quite bulky, but I got there in the end. Then I sew the front to the back. With all the sewing done, it's now time to move on to the stuffing. And because I wanted Kero to sit on my shoulder, I actually got a magnet, as you can see here, it got stuck to my scissors, and put it inside a little pouch which would sit in his bum. I also filled this pouch with a bunch of weighted pellets so that he would be butt heavy and hopefully sit on my shoulder. After inserting the pouch, it was then time to stuff him, and I just used regular teddy bear stuffing and did it until he felt the right kind of firmness. I then attached his head, and finally I used a little bit of feather trim to give him that little puffy tail. So I just finished him. He's a little bit wonky, but I absolutely love him, and as you can see, he sits on my shoulder. He'll sit a lot nicer when I'm wearing the actual costume, because obviously I'm wearing a loose fitting t-shirt, so the plate that he's sitting on is moving a lot underneath. But yeah, he's not coming off. There we go. Happy. Alright, before we start diving into how the Clow staff was made, let me run you through the journey it has taken to get to this point. 4 months before I needed this costume done, I downloaded the 3D print files offline, which hopefully I'll link down below, and sent them off to my local library. because if you remember last time I tried to get something 3D printed from my library, it took them a month to do it. So I thought 4 months, fine, absolutely fine, we'll get it done in time. So I send them through the file and I don't hear anything from them for a month. So I go in and see them and I'm like, hey, dropped off a file, any chance, you know, you can give me a guesstimate of when that's going to get printed? And I was served by a lovely young lady who wasn't part of the 3D printing team but said, oh my god, you're not the first person that is happening to, I'm so sorry. About a month ago the 3D printer broke and they didn't tell anyone, so it's been replaced and I'll get them to get back to you. So that was cool, she was very helpful. Anyway, a week goes by since that and then I finally hear back from the 3D printing team and they basically say, you're now part of the queue. That's it. That was the entirety of that message. I emailed them back being like, hey, I need this done by X date. Are you able to let me know whether or not it will get printed in time for that? Because if not, I have to source it elsewhere because I'm running out of time to, you know, finish and paint it myself. I hear nothing back from them whatsoever. And another month goes past. So I put out a post on my Instagram being like, hey, is there anybody in the country who's able to 3D print these files for me because I am being ghosted by my library here? Then I get a message back from Thane of Falkreath, thank you so much, and he offers to print the staff for me. And he prints it and he sends it up to me and I get it, I think 2 weeks before it's needed. And he was such a champ, he also sanded and primed it for me, so all I had to do was paint it and glue it together. After I receive his print in the post, a week goes by. We're now 2 weeks out from the deadline of the convention and I get an email back from the library saying, your print is done, please come collect it. After not hearing back from them for months. So yeah, that is the story of 3D printing disaster. I think next time if I want to get something 3D printed at the library, I'm going to send it to them like a whole year in advance because yeah, it's a bit stressful to deal with it otherwise. Anyway, here is me painting the Clow wand. So as I mentioned in my little monologue / rant there, the pieces came to me pre-primed and pre-sanded, so once again, thank you so much, it made my job so much easier. Paint-wise, I'm using assorted metallic and pearlescent paints from the brand Lumiere and one glitter folk art one, which I'll show you what I use that for right now. So I start off by doing a base of the pearlescent magenta on the little round bits that go inside of the wings. Once I'd done a few layers and they'd all dried, I then stippled on the glitter one that I just showed you earlier, and I did this using a sponge and just did several layers till it looked nice. And yeah, basically all that was left to do was paint absolutely everything else and then leave it to dry overnight. And then once dry, gluing it all together. And there you have it, that is how I made all of the props for my Cardcaptor Sakura costume. I am so happy with how they all turned out because when I made this the first time, I only had the Kero, I didn't even attempt a book or a Clow wand. My favourite of the props by far, the Clow book. It's just insanely practical for what it is. I can fit my phone and my wallet in there, so I will in fact be using this as a handbag at the convention. Again, a huge shout out to Thane of Falkreath for 3D printing the staff for me, because as we all know, relying on your local library to do such things doesn't really work out now, does it? He did a beautiful job and I absolutely love it. I actually cried opening it because this is like childhood dream come true right here. As you can see, The whole costume is complete, and this is the last video in this series. If you want to see how I made any of the other pieces for this costume, I will link everything down below so you don't miss anything. If you like this video, make sure to drop a like down below if you really liked it, maybe even a comment, maybe even subscribe. I do a lot of sewing, crafting and fun related things here on this channel. With all that being said, I'll see you guys next week. Goodbye!